organic farmers. So some of these things may be, less applicable to organic farmers, but a lot of these things are applicable to both. So we'll move on to the first slide. My family has been farming in Saskatchewan for about 100 years. That's a picture of my grandpa, who's passed on now, but in one of the crops that he wanted to show off in pictures. We've been trying to figure out how to farm the best way we can here for a long time, and this intercropping is a very new, very outside of the box technique that doesn't necessarily fit easily with the types of agronomic practices that people like my grandpa or my dad have been used to using. But farmers face difficult choices right now with the arrival of difficult agronomic problems. Every choice we have made is a decision of what problems we will have, whether intentionally or not. The problems that we have are often caused by the kind of crops, rotations, and techniques in use in each region and in each field. Think the weeds and the diseases that are problematic. We've basically unintentionally chosen them. Next slide. Agriculture is not a recipe you can follow indefinitely. It's an art and science of extracting food from an environment that is at best indifferent to our intentions and success. So change is inevitable and necessary, and intercropping is I think, a way of responding to that environment. It is a technique that has caught my attention as an applied researcher at Redbird. It is used extensively in areas with labor-intensive agriculture, but has had very poor uptake or successful demonstration in North America among grain farmers. Recently, there has been a resurgence of mixed grain intercropping, along with other biologically adaptive techniques like cover crops. Next slide. Some research groups have undertaken to figure out how to make it work. A growing number of farmers are also figuring it out with us. I am by no means the first proponent of this approach. While waiting for someone else to organize the intercrop innovators on the farm and on research stations, I got impatient and started doing it myself. So that puts me in an interesting position of leading this, trying to lead something to do with this intercropping, and but it makes for some very interesting conversation. It has been said that nature abhors a vacuum. Oversimplified rotations and vast fields of monocrops are much like a vacuum as far as the biological underpinnings of our environment are concerned. That vacuum is currently being filled by herbicide-resistant kochia, root rots, and other difficult problems among conventional farmers. And I think there's problems with monoculture and oversimplified rotation sometimes in organic agriculture as well. But we can't convince people to use 4 or 6 year rotations if they are losing money on some of those years. It isn't good enough to only have 1 or 2 crops that are profitable in a region. We need to find a way to make crop diversity pay the bills. That was my impetus behind working on intercrops. Might as well advance 1 or 2 slides. Intercropping creates different problems while mitigating others. In the view of the successful intercropping farmers, new problems of separating grain and adapting equipment are preferable to the old problems they were facing. Namely, for conventional people, mounting chemical and fertilizer bills, yield instability, and for organic producers, it's rampant weeds, I think, would be the main problem. And, maybe not enough fertility due to not being able to grow very much pulses in rotation. In general, intercropping farmers are using less inputs and getting good, consistent production, sometimes also higher yields. Intercropping doesn't remove the difficult problems, but it may mitigate the damage that they cause. The goal when I'm evaluating and optimizing intercrop agronomy is to find grain crops that can be seeded at the same time and harvested together. So I've been doing that since 2012 at Redbird. The intercrop that people are most familiar with is, I think, pea and canola. It's not new. They were grown before hybrid canola came along and were basically pushed out by Liberty and Roundup tolerant canola hybrids. So it's certainly an option for producers to do a pea and canola, but it's one where I don't know if you always get a large yield benefit. It really depends on how healthy your pea or your canola crop are. Now, that's not really relevant to, maybe as relevant to organic producers, but something like a mustard and pea is certainly a possible combination. Chickpea flax is the first intercrop that I ran trials on. The idea that with that intercrop is to expand the area of adaptation of the chickpea crop, making maturity more reliable, reducing disease pressure, and stabilizing yields. Producers who are growing the chickpeas with flax are doing it for various reasons, but they are finding it lowers their production risk and lowers their disease pressure. Chickpeas require nitrogen stress and moisture stress to reliably ripen, and flax helps to provide this stress at the end of the growing season. Also, having an intercrop that competes better with weeds than either crop on its own is a weed management technique, and that would be attractive potentially to organic producers. One intercrop that does have me all fired up at the moment is lentil and mustard. Currently, lentil producers are facing a lot of problems with weeds, root rot, and unusual rainfall variability damaging their crop. There are indications that lentils grown with mustard are healthier than monocrop lentils, but there has been almost no useful disease evaluations with this crop combination so far. Even given with our terrific monocrop yields and healthy crops for both the mustard on its own and the large green lentil on its own in Redbirds in 2017, we were still able to get over yielding of 15 to 21% in a replicated trial. Now, that was a very low input trial. We had actually no herbicides and no fertilizer, although very minimal nitrogen fertilizer and no other fertilizer added to that. So it's not an organic trial, but I think the results are pretty relevant to organic. There are good biological reasons to expect that a more diverse crop canopy and root system will reduce the severity of many of our common crop diseases and insect pests. This is a largely untapped area of study due to skepticism over producer uptake of the technique. But if there is producer demand for this kind of information, if there's producer acres, then we can start investigating what happens to diseases and what happens to some of these pests under a more diverse system. Apart from this, by having two crops in a field, intercropping can reduce the outbreak of pests and diseases due to the compensating effects of the other crops. If one crop is thinned out or damaged by a pest, the companion crop will often compensate by increasing growth and production in those areas. If excessive moisture damages the pulse crop, an oilseed crop may well fill in to compensate. In fact, we saw this in a chickpea flax trial this year at Redbird. I was very displeased to see that standing water knocked out chickpeas in a low spot for several plots. But the flax survived and established ground cover and produced yield, actually 30 bushels per acre worth, even at quite a low flax seeding rate. So not so good for my research trial objective, but a very good example of the benefits of intercrop. Let's go ahead. I've got a slide with the large green lentil in a monocrop that's very lodged. The next one is the large green lentil with brown mustard. It stands up really nicely and was producing very good yield. There's a large green lentil with the yellow mustard in the next slide that is also not lodged. It stands really well and had produced high yields, and you can just see how that's a much taller canopy that's going to compete better with weeds. In the next slide, it's got a little summary of the results from that green lentil and yellow mustard. So we were getting high value and less risk overall, I think, and that's one of the things that's going to drive intercropping on the conventional side and on the organic side. So a well-planned intercrop will reduce lodging and increase podding height in crops like lentils, which should improve harvestability and quality of the crop. So it is through these mechanisms that mixed grain intercrops are a means of managing production risk. And the intercrop trend is driven both by an appreciation of the benefits of biological diversity and a desire to fatten production margins. It's one of those cases where less is not more. More is more. So let's go on to the frequently asked questions. Now, before I get to that, the goals of an intercrop. What I've generally found when I'm talking to people is they say, I want to try intercropping, and I say, well, what are you trying to achieve? What kind of crop are you trying to grow as your predominant crop? And then, I try to look at a few options for a companion crop that is going to help them to get their main crop. And then you design, seeding rates, and you design, their companions in order to try to help them achieve what it is they want. So if they want to be able to produce organic lentils or organic peas or something like that, or they want to be able to have a really nice clean field, a clean field of flax with a chickpea, well, then you can go ahead and try to pick select seeding rates, or, in the case of conventional, sometimes adjusting fertility in order to get the kind of crop mix that you want. So, for example, we had soybean and flax, conventional soybean and flax in 2017, which could be potentially an organic crop. But because we had quite a high nitrogen situation, we ended up with a lot more flax and less soybeans than what I wanted. The land equivalency ratio was still over 1, but I think people that were planting that crop would look at it and go, that's not really what I was wanting. You wanted at least half your crop probably being soybeans and half flax, or 3/4 soybeans and 1/4 flax, I think, because the soybeans are a larger seed. You don't want to plant one soybean and get 6 back. That's not a very good return on the effort that you're putting in for that. So that balance of crops that you're trying to achieve depends on the value of the 2 crops you're combining. You may want one of more and less of the other. You're always going to get some of both, and you can try to adjust your seeding rates and conditions, maybe seeding timing or seeding depths, in order to achieve that. Let's see. So let's go on to the frequently asked questions. The first page is, who is intercropping? So both conventional and organic producers. In general, I find that this is a younger generation of farmers that are willing to look at doing this, and usually mid-sized farms to smaller farms. Now, I'm quite happy to help the larger farms try to fit this into their production, but usually they're not looking to make things more complicated. They're looking to make things less complicated. The next slide, there's a picture of Derek and Tanis Axton, who won the Outstanding Young Farmer Award. They're not organic farmers, but they're definitely what falls under this sort of a new umbrella of new conventional. It's a hybrid of organic and conventional techniques, and they're doing some very innovative things that they've been recognized for, and are off to the National Outstanding Young Farmer competition, I guess it is, in Ontario shortly. So I'm quite happy to see that is being recognized by some, at least, as cutting edge of agriculture. So he can be my poster boy, I guess, for the type of farmers that, and Tanis also. Tanis is a biologist. So it's a combination of the whole family that's providing the brains and the will to come up with a new production system, basically. And that's the kind of innovation that it takes to be able to adapt intercropping for Saskatchewan, and I'm happy to see that's happening. The next slide on the FAQs. how do you seed that? People are always, they want to know how to seed it. The organic producers are, in general, having less access to a double shoot kind of drill. Unless you go and buy an older air seeder that has double shoot capacity, you may end up having to do 2 passes. One option is to broadcast a small seeded crop and drill in a large seeded one. So, which is fine as long as you're, watching your rates, watching the seeding rates. It's a little bit hard to determine if you're broadcasting what your seeding rate will be in the end. So you may have a little bit less control over your ultimate plant densities if you're broadcasting versus using a drill. So my preference is to usually put the peas or the large seed, the pulses, down the fertilizer shanks, and the smaller seed down the seed shanks. And that allows you to seed the peas deeper than the pulses deeper than a smaller seed crop. So this is definitely something that you need to have in mind when you're planting 2 crops, is you may be seeding at 2 different depths. If you are trying to seed both in a mixture at the same depth, then you need to be pretty careful of what depth you're choosing, what moisture you're going into, to make sure that you don't get, one of your crops stranded in dry dirt or seeded too deep to actually emerge. Next slide. Alternating rows is one of the ways that people are trying to seed this. It gives you a little more certainty that your crops will both be well established, not shaded too much. But I'm not sure that I'm not convinced it's necessary for most of our intercrops. But the chickpea flax, that has been the way that people are usually orienting them. And variable rate seeding is a really interesting possibility for doing double crops, and sometimes people are doing this with triple crops, whereas maybe they're seeding more seed or less seed depending on their location on slopes, or maybe if there's saline patches or some kind of landscape variability. The ability to adjust seeding rate for 2 crops is very interesting possibility that I'm hoping people are going to play around with, and in order to optimize their crops so that you get a nice even crop that's easy to harvest, instead of maybe having some problems in some low spots, or having thin areas on the hills where you didn't need to. Okay, next slide. Seeding rate. In general, I like to tell people to aim high for pulses. In India, where they do a lot of intercropping with pulses, they're seeding a normal pulse seed rate or very close to it, and then doing a quite a low seeding rate with their cereals or oil seeds. So in general, we're not doing a 50-50 of each crop. In general, it's more than 100% seeding rate combined. So if you want 20% over yielding, I generally figure that you need 120% of the plant or more seeded in order to be able to achieve that. Because there's a lot of competition going on. You're encouraging competition. You're trying to crowd out the weeds in order to get that kind of level of production. I think we need to not short the crop on the amount of seeds that we're putting in the ground. And lately I've been looking at the ratios of the different plants to try to optimize that. So, for example, for our lentil crop this year that worked with the mustard, I had 6 lentils for every yellow mustard plant. That was a good balance for the lentils, because I had a really good 95% of the monocrop lentil crop. That's a good, strong lentil crop, and then the mustard was a bonus. That's what I was going for, so that's the kind of plant ratios that I wanted to achieve in order to get that. Whereas in 2016, I had about 1 lentil for every mustard plant, so I ended up with very little mustard, or very little lentils, quite a lot of mustard, and I don't think that's an intercrop that people are going to be that happy with. if you only get 200 or 300 pounds an acre of lentils and quite a bit of mustard. Next slide. How do you harvest it? So desiccants isn't really applicable to the organic guys, but swathing definitely is. There's a lot of these that, you are probably going to end up swathing. And swathing timing, you're going to have to, just try to optimize it best you can. That's one of the reasons for trying to pick a main crop and a companion crop, is that you're trying to optimize the swathing timing or the kill timing for your main crop, and then, be prepared to do some drying or whatever, or take a little bit of shattering losses on the companion crop. So in general, you're setting the combine for your large seed and turning down the wind to retain the smaller seed. And that's very general. I can't tell people, specific combine settings. There are producers that would be able to tell you that. But, we have a 4-foot winter steiger that's with no electronic controls whatsoever, so I don't have anything very useful to tell you on that. The flax, people are quite concerned in general about being able to thresh the flax out of some of their other crops. But with the chickpeas are acting like little ball bearings in your combine and are actually threshing the flax bolls. Sometimes if you don't have enough chickpeas in the area that you're combining, the chickpeas aren't doing their job threshing the flax bolls, so you may end up with a lot of flax bolls either going out the back of the combine or ending up in the hopper. Now, they can be cleaned out after if you got them in the hopper, and I've seen people doing that, running an auger into their combine to re-thresh them. But if they go out the back, then that is lost. So in general, you really do need to have a strong crop of the chickpeas in order to ensure that your flax is going to thresh well. If you have mostly flax with only a little bit of chickpeas, you're going to have to be unhappy with how that threshes. Okay, the next slide, can mixed grain be stored? Or how fast do I have to separate it? This is something we don't really have a good handle on yet. I'm talking to Tammy about doing some little moldy grain storage trials in order to figure out how they can be safely stored. It would be nice to be able to store these mixed grains for a couple of months until harvest is good enough finished, so that you've got time to process them. Some people, if you have a small acreage, then processing it right off of the combine is, it's nice if you can do it, but it depends on how many acres you have and how busy you are at the time. And I don't want this, the requirement to separate it to be keeping people from intercropping if they're afraid that they're not going to have time to do it in harvest. So it is possible to store them mixed as long as both of them are dry in their own right. That's been the experience of the guys that are doing this mixed grain intercropping. You basically treat it as you would a crop with high dockage. So you have to watch. Let's say you have some high moisture flax in with lentil or something like that. You would have to manage that as though it was, high moisture weed seeds or something in with your crop. So you handle it carefully, watch it closely, but it doesn't necessarily have to be separated right away off the combine. Next slide. What do you do with the mixed grain? You separate it if it's worthwhile, and you sell it as grain with high dockage if it's not worth separating. But it's best to be prepared to separate it and have the equipment available to separate it well ahead of time, and then you can decide when you come up to it if there's enough of the companion crop in there to make it worthwhile to spend the time separating. So that will depend on whether that companion crop is contaminated with some kind of a weed seed that's hard to clean out, or if the maturity was good so that the quality is still good. So it depends on what the quality of your separated product will be, whether it's worth separating. In general, we're trying to find intercrops with a large seed size difference in order to facilitate fast cleanout. So dockage cleaners, the cleaners that are meant to just clean weed seeds out of your grain before you market it, have quite large capacity. On the organic scale, that should be, quite sufficient to be able to put a crop through. And I think maybe organic producers are all a bit better set up with grain cleaning equipment because they're already cleaning out weed seeds a lot of the time. So there may be more comfort level with the cleaning and separating among organic farmers than there is currently with conventional farmers. What can you intercrop? That's the next slide. There's kind of a short list and not an exhaustive one. These are all basically ones that I've tried, and things like maple peas are any kind of pea that's prone to lodging, hard to grow on its own, and is a premium product, seems to be a very nice fit with intercropping with something like an oil seed or maybe a cereal that will hold it up, and you're getting a premium product that way. The conventional soybean and flax is one that I think may be of interest to the organic producers because there are markets for organic conventional soybeans that are currently being supplied by imports from India that maybe are of questionable quality. So I think there's maybe some inroads to be made on that. Certainly there's markets for the lentils. I understand there's markets for organic mustard. So your crop combination really depends on what you can produce, what you can sell as a crop. Because, yes, you do have the option of growing maybe a non-GMO canola, but I don't know what markets you have potentially, for an organic production of that versus some other oil seeds like flax. That's a more established market. Next slide. Is anyone actually doing this? I get tired of answering this question because the people that ask it, assume they already know the answer. They assume no one is doing it. And the reality is that it's a growing trend, but the data on acres is really difficult to get because so far no one is collecting it. It's not really being collected, or hasn't been in the past collected by Saskatchewan Crop Insurance. They've managed to get a handle on 34,000 acres that was insured in 2017, but they may well have other insured acres that they haven't identified as intercrop because of the way they're reported. And there's other acres that I know are not accounted for in that total because those producers aren't using crop insurance. Crop insurance hasn't got a very good handle on how to do intercrops, and in some ways intercrops are self-insuring in terms of that they kind of compensate for yield loss. In terms of a really bad drought, you're still going to get lower total production, but a lot of the other crop factors that maybe would reduce your yield are mitigated somewhat by intercropping. So crop insurance is a tricky question. The next slide has a couple of grain separating setups. This one is a quick clean. There's a couple of Farm King grain separators that people use. There's a couple other different brands, but in general, they're designed to handle large quantities and do a very rough clean on large quantities of grain. The next slide, I'm not sure, that would be more of interest to the research people that I've got some ideas on that, if usually with research we're trying to look for differences in yield. And so if you don't have a difference in, say, your lentil yield between your intercrop and your monocrop, the default for people doing analysis of this is to say, oh, there's no difference, therefore the data wasn't good. If you have no difference in yield between a monocrop lentil and an intercrop lentil, that's good. But there's a little bit of a different mindset that you have to have when designing these. Sometimes we get higher monocrop pulse yields than we did in the intercrop, but if you look at the total value of the crop, oftentimes we're better off with the intercrop. So we'll just skip back past some of the researchy things that might be of interest to some of you. With the research, we don't always see land equivalency ratios that are just kind of hitting it out of the ballpark. Like sometimes we get 20%, 30% over yielding, or increasing the total value of the crop. Sometimes the total value of the crop is very similar to or a little less than maybe it was with a monocrop. But if you're improving harvestability by reducing lodging, if you're improving quality by reducing lodging, if you're getting more consistent maturity, if you're reducing weed competition and weeds going into the seed bank, then even if you're getting a very similar total return or total yield, I think there's still a good value proposition for the intercrops. So, I don't think we should be too hasty to say, well, that's not worth doing. When you really have to look at all of the benefits that intercrop could be providing over short term and over the longer term for things like these. So if an intercrop can stabilize yields at a profitable level, and it's good for your agronomy, good for your diversity, good for your weed populations and competition and things like that in general, I think that's a reason that intercrops are going to expand, but people need to get their heads around what the value proposition is with these. Next slide. So, if you're interested in any of this, yes, get on Twitter. Twitter there's a very interesting gathering point of people, and it's not, yes, it's for companies to flog their latest stuff and lots of silliness that goes on Twitter. But if you are following the right sorts of progressive farmers, researchers, and people that are interested, then you get to be part of a network, and it may enable you to find producers in your area who are intercropping.
Sorry, Lana, I'm just going to interrupt for just a sec.
Yeah.
I think maybe one person has their phone not on mute that might be outside or in their vehicle. If you don't mind just popping that back on mute, that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, there's some noise coming in. So there's an intercropping workshop on November 29th. Unfortunately, it's sold out now, but we are looking at booking another one in January because there's just overwhelming interest in this intercropping conference from, the 3 prairie provinces, North Dakota, South Dakota. There's people coming up for this from quite a big area, and Saskatchewan agriculture people are kind of overwhelmed by the level of interest, and I'm thrilled about the level of interest because I've been trying to tell them that the intercropping people, the farmers want people to tell them how to intercrop, and the researchers are waiting for the farmers to intercrop before we'll tell them how to do it. And there's this funny catch-22 going on. So in the meantime, I'm just trying to slog around, finding what little bit of funding I can find, working with whoever I can in order to give us the best little bit of information we can on how to intercrop, so that farmers will be able to intercrop, and then we can start getting enough acres that we can get some more research funding devoted to answering these questions better. That, I think, is mostly what I had wanted to say on this. So we should have time for questions.
Yeah, we definitely do. Thanks so much, Lana. I really, really appreciated the talk. I think intercropping, some people have started it, some people are interested, so it's really timely presentation. So if you have some questions for Lana, feel free to take your phone off mute while you ask your question, and I'll just open up the floor.
Well, if no one's going to jump in, Janine here. I have an example of a very successful intercrop that I saw in southeastern Alberta quite a few years ago. Would people like to hear about it?
Go for it.
Sure.
Okay, well, it was an experienced organic farmer on a pivot operation. This was a pivot field, southeast Alberta. He had a flax crop hailed out the year before, which was a significant financial loss. And so he wanted to try and experiment with chickpeas, which he had never grown before. So he had seeded a full rate of chickpeas at the usual rate for that area. I can't remember exactly what it was. And it wasn't coming, and it wasn't coming, and it wasn't coming. And his son sort of got over anxious and seeded a full rate of barley on that field. And when I went to inspect it in July, it looked like a very interesting barley intercrop, a barley flax intercrop. But and he'd avoided it because he felt badly about it. He'd apologized to me. He said, "I'm afraid I've got a dog's breakfast of a field. I've been thinking of working it under." But when we went to see it, I said, "Oh, you know, do you still want to work this under?" And we walked in, and every step was pop, 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 pop. We looked down. All the weeds were minuscule. There was a whole understory of chickpeas and the flax and the barley. And it was a beautiful crop, which he had the ability to clean, separate. And he actually phoned me when he sold it to say that he'd never received such value from per acre before, and that apparently a lot of chickpeas in that region and in a lot of Canada had a real mold problem that year. I can't remember exactly which mold disease it was, but he didn't have a spot of it on his. And he talked to some people who thought that it was because of the barley in there, that both the flax and the chickpeas might have been susceptible to it with the density of the crop, but the barley seemed to neutralize it. So he was just so proud of that, he had to phone and thank me for convincing him not to till it under. But I just wanted folks to hear that story because he was very pleased with the end result.
Awesome. Thanks, Janine. And yeah, I agree. I think there are a lot of really good examples across the prairies of maybe sometimes what were mistake intercrops, but that really have opened up some opportunities to try new things. Any more questions from people on the call or comments?
Hi, maybe more Scott Beaton calling from Roster, Manitoba. I'd wondered a little bit more examples of intercrops that are using a cereal. I think that's maybe a weak point it definitely is in my rotation, and I wonder if it is for a lot of other guys too, in terms of economics. And since that was something you mentioned early on, I thought that was maybe an important part of our rotation to focus on.
It's not something that I have a lot very useful to say, because I've generally been concentrating on combining broadleaf in intercrops for further reasons of, because we're doing conventional agriculture, so we spray out our cereals in the broadleaf crops. But the intercrops are definitely a worthwhile thing to try with the cereals, but cereals are a lot more competitive than something like a pulse. So you really have to sacrifice on your seeding rate of your cereals, and therefore your yield of your cereals, in order to try to get something else established in there. So that's mostly the suggestion I would have. There's certainly some interest in doing like a triple crop with, a pulse and oil seed and a cereal. There's potential to do that, and if you've got the time to spend separating it, something. But that's an interesting possibility anyway.
Thanks, Lana. Thanks, Scott, for the question. I think I heard someone else start to ask a question at the same time as Scott, so you can go ahead.
Yes, it's Laurie here. I farm just north of Edmonton. I guess one question I've got is, where can we get information on these different trials and different varieties to use? Is there any place?
There's really not much of a central location yet. No, I think we need to improve on that, because there's little bits of research and things going on in a few different places, but it's not easy access. And I don't know of any that's going on in Manitoba, or I mean in Alberta. There's, I think the types of varieties that you're using for pulses, you want to look for things that are tall and a bit more indeterminate. For cereals, the varieties, like say the oats that you've been maybe using that have the broader leaves that are where you're trying to shade out the weeds, are not necessarily going to be a good combination with in an intercrop, because that's going to provide too much competition and too much shading. So, a narrower leaved oat or something might work better. But our results are going to be on the AgriArm website for Saskatchewan, but one of the best places you can find information is actually on Twitter. So people will link to wherever the disparate places that reports are posted or results they have. You can often find those on Twitter. So not a very good answer, I'm sorry.
Okay, because 2 years ago, that's when I started intercropping. I had a crop of fava beans and canola, which we had a dry year that year, so nothing really grew all that tall. But comparing to the monocrops around here, I think I did actually very well on it. Mm-hmm. And this past year here, I tried oats and peas, a crop of oats and peas, and a crop of fava beans and barley. And I guess what I got out of it is I guess I would turn these crops around, because the oats was a little later than the peas, so they didn't mature exactly the same time. Mm-hmm. And the fava beans and the barley matured before the fava beans. So I guess if I do it again, I do it the opposite way.
Well, and that the suggestion to a lot of people is to just try putting things together. Pay close attention to when those normally mature, for sure. So I agree with you. Switching the oats and the barley and those intercrops would make a lot of sense. And then, try to share your experience with other people as much as you can. We did do a fava bean and canola trial this year, and we did a bit last year. And the fava beans are quite productive with an oil seed. They seem to not mind growing with, a bit of competition from something like oil seeds. And it's probably similar with cereals, because maybe they appreciate the shading of it, because they don't really like a lot of heat during when they're forming flowers. They are fairly tall plants, so they've got the capability of going vertical for competition, unlike some other things like lentils. So, yes, all those observations is basically what the other intercroppers are doing, is they're trying different combinations on a fairly small scale, figuring out what works for them, and then scaling it up.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Lana. And I think that's a really important thing to mention, is when trying different things, whether it's intercropping or other things on farm, it's always important to do it on a number of acres first, or leave check strips so you can actually see where the improvements are, or where you can make some differences in your production system. So thanks, Lori, for the question. Are there any more questions from the group?
Yes, I have one.
Go for it.
Hello?
Hi.
Yeah, I'm Curtis Cox. Organic farmer east of Winnipeg. I was wondering if anybody out there has ever tried anything with a clover crop. What I am kind of thinking of doing, I have an established red clover field, and I'm kind of throwing around the idea of putting in a high nitrogen use crop, like possibly hemp or quinoa or flax, into a standing an established red clover crop already.
there's people, this gets, off into the clover weeds a little bit, but there are people that are trying to, do the kind of a relay crop or a half killing something like a forage crop and seeding into it. And it really depends on what kind of, you generally are going to have to weaken that forage in some way.
Yeah.
And, whether you can do half a job of tilling it up in the fall, and then, it's going to take a little while to reestablish nicely in the spring, which will give an opportunity to some of your other crops to establish. But I'd be pretty careful. Watch that you're not doing a crop that's uncompetitive on its own. The hemp might work, but you're going to have to do a pretty good job of handicapping your clover. Obviously the hemp is going to get a lot taller than the clover, but it's not very fast out of the gate as far as competition goes. So even if you went and cultivated a little in the spring and then put your hemp in, just after that may be okay. But yeah, you definitely want to beat up any kind of a forage that you're seeding.
Yeah. I was thinking of doing like 2 passes with narrow spikes just to kick the clover a little bit and see what happens from there. So
yeah, it's certainly worth a try.
Yeah,
you're going to suppress a lot of your weeds, and the thing you don't know is how even and nice your main crop is going to be, but it's worth a try.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for your question. Due to the number of people on the call, I probably won't run through the list today. So if you're waiting for me to call on you, probably you can ask your question now, or we'll have a couple more questions and probably finish the call.
Ted Franklin calling for country. Can you hear me now?
Just talk a little louder, Jed.
Say what?
Go for it. Let's see.
Okay, I had a question. If anyone has done any or heard of any research on combining a winter cereal with a spring seeded crop. I've done it a couple of years on the farm now, and I've had some success with it.
Janine,
it depends. Are you harvesting your winter cereal also, or are you plowing it down and then seeding your spring cereal?
I have done both, but for example, one year I seeded rye and oats together, and the winter cereal stays vegetative, and so I seeded them both in the spring, and you get a dense cover and a tremendous rye crop the following year. But the rye won't go to seed the first year.
Yeah, there's a number of different strategies there. It's basically a relay crop, which was, kind of outside of the scope of what I was, wanting to talk about, because it gets, the seeding and the harvesting timings gets to be a lot more interesting. And it's kind of a different conversation as far as you don't have to separate the grain physically. It's being separated in time, but it's a matter of when you're able to harvest that, each one, and if you're going to damage one while harvesting the other. But yes, seeding oats with the rye, I think that makes good sense.
Janine Gibson here. I'd just like to share as another experience of being an organic inspector. Kashmir and May Sokolsky, who farm just northwest of Beausejour, Manitoba, said that they brought over a Ukrainian tradition from her family, where all of their cereal crops, they would go in 2 weeks after they seeded the cereal, depending on the growing conditions. So they see how far along the crop was, and they would broadcast rye into the fields. And they had some of the cleanest fields I'd ever seen. I inspected them for a number of years before they retired. And they said that they got into doing that because some years it was so wet in the fall and wet in the spring that they couldn't do anything, so that they would usually work the rye in as a green manure, but if they couldn't, they would just let it go and then harvest it the next year. But that when I would walk in those fields, they'd be beautiful. At first I thought, what are these guys doing? I was a bit suspicious. But once I walked in the field and opened it up, underneath there would be like a lawn of rye, really short, and then the dominant crop well above it. And he'd said in his 35 years of doing that, he'd only had a couple of years where the rye had actually damaged his yield. But I think they had a lot of technique finesse with it. But I just share that. That's my experience with cereals and intercropping.
Yeah, that sounds, like something, especially in wetter areas, like a really good strategy.
They had a beautiful farm. Thanks.
Thanks, Janine and Jed. I think we have some time for one more question, and if your question doesn't get caught this time, you can send me an email and I'll make sure it gets answered. But if one more person wants to share a question or a story, feel free to go for it now.